Hey, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. I'm very excited about today's chat with Dr. Eddie S. Glaude Jr. But first, thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. Another note to point out, the studio will be taking a much-deserved vacation for a couple of weeks in early August. But don't fret, we have previously recorded interviews. They are going to be interesting nonetheless, and we hope you'll tune in for that. And we'll be back with our normal recording schedule for the 24th of August. So that weekend, we will be posting our usual episodes. Okay, it's time for Dr. Eddie S. Glaude Jr. He is an author, political commentator, and educator who examines the complex dynamics of the American experience. He is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and is a former president of the American Academy of Religion. He frequently appears in the media as a columnist for Time magazine and regularly appears on MSNBC and Meet the Press. His most recent book is 2020's Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. And he is host of the podcast, History is Us. Dr. Glaude, welcome to the back room.
Oh, it's my pleasure to join you. Looking forward to the conversation.
So before we get into some of the more meaty subjects, I always like to peel back the onion a little bit and talk about people when they're growing up. And tell me about your childhood. Where'd you grow up and what was life like? And were you always kind of a social justice, political news nerd kind of guy?
That's a fascinating question. So I grew up on the coast of Mississippi, a small town called Moss Point, Mississippi, named after the moss that hang from magnolia trees and cypress trees, the moss that shadowed, bayou rivers and the like, My dad was a postman, the second African-American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And my mother was a custodial worker at Ingalls Shipyard. No real college, folks, college graduates in the family, really. Didn't grow up with books, working class, hardworking class people, family. My dad was this kind of overbearing presence, he was this man who scared the shit out of me with a glance, with a glare. And he also deposited not only fear in my gut, but a kind of, insistence on fighting for right, fighting for good, right, standing up for myself in a way. So it was a really complex childhood, right? Trying to deal with finding my own voice in a very small town and dealing with, as many of us do, the overbearing presence of a man who played and plays such a significant role in your self-understanding, So it's an interesting journey. And Moss Point is predominantly Black. It's the labor force for the predominantly white town, Pascagoula. Just to give you a sense of the place, Trent Locke was the representative from our area, from Pascagoula, yeah, so.
And that kind of dysfunction, I understand that because you're kind of describing a lot of what my childhood was like. And my father was a taxi driver. We were blue collar, and my father didn't make it past the 8th grade. I was the only person in my family to go to college. And so one wonders, when you come from that kind of environment, how do you break out of that? How do you find the self-esteem, the self-worth, determination, the ambition to rise above that and become independent enough to not become that and instead become something else? How did that work for you?
I think it's a combination of things, right? So even though my mother didn't graduate high school, she had to drop out in the 9th grade to have her first baby, my sister. My dad didn't go to college. They had a sense, though, of what they expected of us. Whenever they were basically growing up with us, he was 21, she was 20 when they married. But I remember when report card day would happen, he would line us up outside of the living room and call us in one by one. And would chastise us if we had a B on our report card. My sister graduated valedictorian, the first African-American to graduate valedictorian of our high school. And immediately they had 2 valedictorians that year, one white and one Black. She went on to go to Spelman College, and then I followed her. So there's a sense in which the expectations of excellence, of hard work, that were the values imparted to us by our mother and father, and also this broader community, folks who noticed that you had something in you.
Mm.
My principal, my teachers, my baseball coach. I remember I was a pitcher in Little League and I was getting rocked. And the head coach came out to take me off the mound and I was disrespectful. He took the ball and told me to go sit my little behind on the bench. And, the lessons of character that were imparted in those spaces. So and then of course there's the individual side of it. I have this, I imagine myself in the most expansive of terms. So here I am in this small town, and I'm reading, Tolkien's trilogies. I'm getting lost, in Terry Brooks's fantasy worlds, like The Sword of Shannara. I'm reading under my bed. I almost set the bed on fire with a candle because I wanted to get away from everyone. So there was this kind of, the qualitative leap that my imagination afforded me. So I could see myself in worlds that extended beyond, my little town. And my dad, as complicated as he is, facilitated it in his own way. So I think it's a combination of grit and how can I put this, Doc? It's a kind of hard love that leaves its bruises and scars, but it's love nevertheless.
That's what's really important. Is it's not so much where your parents come from and what they don't have, but it's what they instill in you and want you to become. When a child is raised in a certain environment, can you stop them from eventually becoming who they are? Are they going to be who they are no matter where they live, what challenges they might experience, what obstacles might be in their path? And clearly you're an example of that. How long did you take your dad's encouragement or lack thereof into your adulthood? Did it take you a long time to sort of reconcile the man he was versus the man you wanted to be?
Yeah. Again, I said he deposited fear in my gut.
Mm.
And I've been, for much of my life, I've been trying to prove that I'm not a coward. Because he scared me so. Not because he would put his hands on me, but he was just that kind of figure. I would have nightmares of us fighting, and I would be getting the best of him, and then I would wake up. Right up until late into my adulthood, trying to figure out where this man ended and where I began. And it's only as I got older where my judgment of him was more generous, where this account that I just gave you emerged. I basically ran away from home at 16.
Wow.
I left. I wanted to get away from him, and I left and went to college. I went to Morehouse College at 16, and I never looked back. I started writing my first book. I just wrote about this. I started writing my first book when I was, I think, in the 8th grade, and it was going to be on the difference between physical abuse and psychological abuse.
Wow.
And the irony, of course, was that I was writing on the typewriter that he bought us because he knew we had to know how to type. You see that?
Oh, yeah. That's,
you see
the irony there is
the
cool.
contradiction?
Sure. And
yeah. So it took a while. It took a while, but I'm here, and I love him to death.
So he's still alive?
Oh yeah, he's still alive, and we talk. He calls me all the time to tell me what I should say on television.
Has there ever been a moment of contrition, a mea culpa moment with him?
Yeah, he gave me an accounting. Oftentimes we're dealing with generational evil that's been passed down. Kind of wounding that isn't that its beginning and end isn't with the person right in front of us. And as we grow and mature, and in some ways that maturity is how do we release ourselves into a different way of being? It requires coming to terms with that self that has been shaped in these ways. And so I remember asking my father a question, and he was sitting at the kitchen table. And mind you, he worked at the post office. So for us, that's high cotton,
Right.
Post office is really good stuff back in the day. And I remember him starting to wipe, crumbs off a table that weren't there, and telling me that he never remembers his mother touching him. My father is my color, but all of his sisters and brothers are really light-skinned. Just a few generations back, people are speaking French. We're on the coast. My last name is Glaude, that's French. And so he grew up with colorism because he's the darkest in the family. And then there's, the stories he used to tell about leaving Catholic school and going to the public school, and how those stories used to be about how good he was with his hands, right? That my dad could really fight. But I never heard what was really behind those stories, that he was bullied, that people said he wasn't going to amount to anything, and he decided to prove them all right. And so he gave me an account. And from that point on, I began a journey of judging him less and trying to understand him more. And that freed me up, to become the man that I'm trying to be at the age of 54.
It's so fascinating. I've had people on the podcast, and we've talked about this kind of stuff, issues with parents, and they eventually get the mea culpa moment, I'm sorry, I did the best I could, And it's very important to have that moment where you get the apology. It's great because it then allows you to say, okay, I can move forward.
Yeah.
Who were your inspirations growing up? Like when you looked out into the world beyond your family, who lit that fire under you?
To be honest with you, everybody was dead. There were people who were in books, so Martin Luther King Jr. was one. All of those activists in Mississippi during the 60s, they became heroes and heroines. My teachers, Dr. Polk, but a lot of it had something to do with kind of, I don't want to say it was sui generis, that I was unprecedented, but I'm coming out of a household where there are not a lot of books.
Right.
And so, I had to kind of create myself. Miss Mitchell, she was a singer, and she had hurt her throat, hurt her vocal cords, so she had to teach. She taught me history. She had to teach with a microphone. And I remember Miss Mitchell, who loved me to death, and also Miss Lee. And Miss Mitchell was teaching the Civil War, and to show you how crazy it was, I'm sitting up here finding I love Stonewall Jackson. It doesn't make any damn sense. But Miss Mitchell assigned me to present on King's I Have a Dream speech. And I remember going to the library, getting the album, and having to start it over and over again, and memorized it. And from that moment on, everything changed. But, actually prior to that, give you a sense of my dad's complexity. I remember in the 4th grade, Miss Davis, because I was in advanced classes, so I was always kind of one of 3 or one of 2 or the only one in my class, Black person. And I remember my 4th grade teacher singling me out in a way that was unacceptable to me. And I screamed, "You are racist," and I ran out of the classroom. I thought I was going to get killed, Doc. I thought when I got home, all hell was going to break loose. And my dad called me into the kitchen or wherever we were at the time, and he brought me nose to nose, and he clenched teeth. What happened? And I said, in my own way, in my own scary way, this is what she did. He said, what? What did she say? And I said, this is what she said. And then he clenched his teeth. If anybody ever says some shit like that to you again, you do the same thing. You stand up for yourself. You hear me? And then walked away.
Wow.
So there was this kind of continuum from that moment to that album to what was instilled in me at Morehouse to now.
Quite a journey.
Does that make sense?
It certainly does. So this week we saw President Biden announce a monument for Emmett Till. And my first thought was, how did it take this long in this country, number one? But I want to ask you what your thoughts are on that, but also, even more importantly, the timing of it with what we're living with today in this country with regard to race and racism, institutional racism.
Well, the timing couldn't be more perfect. Here we are engaged in a vexing battle over the story that we tell ourselves, whether it's in Florida or whether it's Moms for Liberty across the country banning books, or efforts to renege on commitments around anti-racism, as the racial reckoning proved itself to be fleeting. So here we are in this moment where there's this battle being waged over the story we tell ourselves, and feelings of guilt and responsibility or culpability, to build and to have in the built environment, a monument to Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley constitutes a physical intervention, because we learn race not just in books, but we learn race by moving about spaces, right? The way cities are organized, the way towns are organized, the way workspaces are, that's how we learn and imbibe certain meanings of who's valued and who's not. So it's an important moment, I think, that, as those persons refuse to look the ugliness and cruelty and barbarity of slavery in its face, and its consequences, to have an Emmett Till monument. An Emmett Till monument is very different than traditional civil rights monuments, right? Because it's not about the triumphant narrative of the heroic efforts of ordinary Black folk and in the country reaching for a more perfect union. Emmett Till is a monument to utter cruelty and barbarity. A 14-year-old lynched, gun put to the head, beaten beyond recognition. And so it's like the lynching memorial in Montgomery. It resists a kind of triumphalist narrative. You have to confront instead what human beings are capable of. It's like the Holocaust Museum, right? This is the horror, right? And so, but then to kind of compare that with Mamie Till Mobley is really important, because it's not just violence. It's also her courage, her heroism. This ordinary Black woman whose faith was unshakable, who said to the folk, no, we're not going to close that casket. I want all these people to see what they did to my baby. And so here you have utter brutality paired with extraordinary courage, activism, agency,
selflessness.
In the midst of a moment that is our current political moment, where ugliness, a kind of mean-spiritedness, threatens to overrun and overwhelm everything. So I think it's beyond, people can think about it in terms of a run-up to the 2024 campaign, trying to get Black voters excited, however you want to think about it, practically or cynically. In this moment, it's just an extraordinary intervention.
No, talking about his mom and what she did and why she did it, as a parent, as a human, how deeply I appreciate what she did and understood the pain behind it. My late wife was an actor and a filmmaker, and she was murdered in 2006. So I've dealt with someone close to me who was murdered. I didn't have to make a decision, especially a political one, in the sense of, should I show the world what she looks like? But I often think about, like, your baby, your 14-year-old, who looked the way he did when they found him, to make that decision, to put it out there for eternity. It's the kind of courage and strength and selflessness that is just unfathomable. It's superhuman,
And just think about that moment now. This, in some ways, the murder of Emmett Till is the response to the Brown v. Board decision of 54. Emmett Till is murdered in August of 55. December of 55, you get the Montgomery bus boycott. By 1957, just 2 years later, you got Little Rock 9. By 1960, you have the formal organization of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because over the last 2 years, from 58 to 60, there's student sit-ins across the South. So this moment, Emmett Till's murder, is on the front end of world historic change, not by the likes of Dr. King, but by the likes of people like Mamie Till Mobley, right? Everyday ordinary people, short sharecroppers, washerwomen, you know, janitors and the like, who dared to strike the blow for freedom. So it's an extraordinary moment in American history and in world history, it seems to me. Yeah.
Mhm. And when Biden said silence is complicity, that speaks volumes of where we are today. Because not only do we have people who are silent, we have people who are just blatantly, shamelessly committing acts of racism without any fear of consequence.
Yeah, it's easy to condemn the monsters. Bryant and Needham, the two men who murdered, along with the other black men who were conscripted to murder Emmett Till. It's easy to condemn them as monsters, right? But I'm thinking about the community of folk. So we live in a world we live in a country that is fraught, right? That is saturated with injustice. And people are going about their days, taking their kids to baseball games, trying to put food on the table. And we've been living like this for a while. Our silence in relation to living in a society that's incarcerating people at rates that are unimaginable. A society where people are dying because they're sick and they don't have money to pay healthcare bills. A society where, depending upon where you live, will dictate what kind of education you receive. So it's easy to condemn the monsters, but those of us who are quiet in response to a world where all of that exists, we become complicit with the monsters. So how can I put this? In the battle against racism, in the battle against anti-Semitism, in the battle against whatever we're fighting, um, they're the loud folk. And then there are the folk who aren't saying anything, and they join. So in the Venn diagram, it's always more people than we think there are.
Right.
That's defending the world that we're claiming is evil, that we're claiming isn't right. So silence is complicity. The challenge isn't the loud racist. The challenge is the person who think that they're decent, but who's quiet in the face of all of this nonsense.
Right. I want to talk about the more macro issue of racism.
Sure.
And it's a great segue to the gentleman who's in that photo behind you, James Baldwin. You wrote a book in 2020 called Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. I want to read a passage from that book. Quote, "I didn't say much at the gravesite. I kneeled down and quietly said thank you as I touched his grave. I stood up and thought to myself, I've been reading Jimmy for 30 years. He has been waiting for us, waiting to see what this history of ours, once we pass through it, has made us all. He still waits." He's really still waiting, right? Like there's no light at the end of that tunnel, is there?
No, no. I mean, part of the debate around history, Doc, is that, we don't want to confront who we are. There are these, it's almost like a ritual practice, There are these moments where we recognize the contradiction at the heart of the American experiment, that we don't really know who we are, right? That revelation runs up against our self-understanding, right? Who we say we are runs up against who we really are, right? Um, and we try to address the contradiction. We try to figure it out, right? You can think about Reconstruction as one of those periods. You can think about the civil rights movement, the legislation of the mid 20th century is one of those periods. And every last one of them, they're immediately followed by the betrayal, by the violent backlash, and then absolution, right? We tried to fix it and then move on. And so Baldwin is like, no. We have to grow the hell up. We keep acting like adolescents, right? We refuse to be responsible for what we've done and for who we are. And we will never get off this hamster wheel um, unless we acknowledge the facts of our past and actually confront it so that we can be better people. You know, you can't be. I say this. I say this when I travel all around the country. You know, you can say all the shit you want to say. Excuse my language about um, how you love your wife and how you're going to be a better husband. But if you don't deal with the lie that you've been telling at the heart of it all, no matter what you do and how you behave, nothing will fundamentally change. So if you're going to really release yourself into being a different kind of human being, a different kind of country, we have to tell the truth about who we are.
But we're moving so far away from that right now. I've got 10 years on you. I don't know how you feel, but and I know this is our country has had a pretty racist history. But
Right.
it just feels like I can't remember when our country was so blatantly, outwardly racist the way it is today. It's easy to point fingers at someone like DeSantis, who pretty much said slaves should be thanking us for how great it was.
Right.
But since Biden took office, over 40 states have introduced or passed laws or taken other measures to restrict how race and issues of racism are taught in this country. That's pretty damn scary because we never seemed as a country to be afraid of our history. Some people may not have wanted to talk about it, but like now we're like, let's erase that history. It's crazy. It just seems like we're in a very unique place in our history, and it's a very scary place.
It is. We're at an inflection point. And you know, like a boxer, when you're young, you got legs and your chin is good. So you could take some blows, right? We're not as young as we used to be as a nation. And so one wonders if we could take this blow on the chin this time, whether or not we have the legs to get up. But you know, they're historical precedents. You think about after radical Reconstruction, what historians call the second founding, where we get our modern notions of citizenship, where you know, we get the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That's where we get due process and the like. Um, what did we get in response to that effort? We got the lost cause. And that didn't originate in the South, by the way. That originated the John Dunning School. That was at Columbia University in New York City. And what is the lost cause? The lost cause is a refusal at its heart. It's a refusal to confront what brought us to the precipice. What happened? What choices did we make to leave over 600,000 bodies on the battlefield? And so you had a generation of kids taught the lost cause across the South and in the Midwest and in the Sun Belt. A generation of kids. And they were taught that Black folk didn't have the capacities to take on the burdens of citizenship. They were taught that the Union armies, the federal government invaded the South, overextended its reach. And you know what? Those folks grew up. And they grew up, many of them, to participate in lynch mobs in Tulsa. They grew up to participate in Rosewood. They grew up, Bryant, Millen, J.W. Millen. They grew up to do what they did to Emmett Till. So how can I put this in an abstract way? Who and what we choose to leave out of our stories all too often reveals the limits of our ideas of justice. Who and what we leave out exposes what our limits of our notions of justice. So people are telling the story or insisting on telling the story this way right now because they don't want to be responsible. They don't want to be held to account. And more importantly, Andy, they're clinging to this idea that this nation must remain white and Christian. It cannot be otherwise. And they know that the demographics suggest otherwise.
You host a podcast called History is
Sure.
Us. It's terrific. And
Thank you.
You ask in one of the episodes, maybe episode 4, what are people like DeSantis so afraid of? What do you think that answer is?
That's a good question. The easy answer is create you know, a multicultural, multiracial America. That's the easy answer. But Baldwin has this wonderful phrase, this wonderful formulation. He says, the messiness of the world is a reflection of the messiness of our interior lives. For some reason, the way in which how he occupies space and time, I think his fears cut much deeper, right? I think his hatreds, his grievance, his his absolute obsession with power by any means actually reflects a deeper wound. So it's easy to say that DeSantis is just a racist who wants to keep the nation white, blah, blah, blah. But I think the pain and terror cuts much deeper. And see, for me, that's important to say because it keeps me from just saying that he's not just simply engaged in monstrous behavior, but it keeps me from saying that he's a monster. Right. And I think that's important. I got to keep in touch with the humanity of these people. Otherwise, right, I become like them. Right. And Baldwin taught me that he says, he says, what I don't want us to do is I want us to imagine creating a self without the need for an enemy. Right. I don't need DeSantis to be an enemy. To me, I see a broken human being. And I don't know why, but I know it's probably deeper than the fact that he just simply doesn't like Black people or brown people or LGBTQ plus people. I know it's something else.
But there's so many broken people then who are following him and lapping up all this rhetoric. What he's doing in the schools. On your podcast, historian Kevin Cruz says, quote, history is about the good and the bad. If you just have the good part, that's not history, it's propaganda. We're moving in this country to this quasi-autocracy that sort of looms above, and we're still dealing with Donald Trump, and he's the front runner, and my God, he could, never say never, he could be president again. And you start to see all the seeds that he planted. The media is the enemy of the people, and how he riled up. There's so many parallels to Germany in the 1920s when Hitler first came on the scene. And Hitler wasn't stopped. Trump was eventually stopped. The system held. It's like a dam. But every once in a while, if you look at a dam and you start to see one little piece of water coming through, you're like, wait a second. In 5 years, is that dam going to crash? Can you say in 2 years, 5 years, we will not be experiencing the end of our democracy like so many other great democracies in history?
No, I mean, what we see is that one of the major political parties has been overrun by these noxious and insidious views. And we also know that there are elements within our country, namely corporate America, that is content to stoke those views as long as they're able to make their profits and control the reins of government in order to hold off regulation as they continue to pursue their relentlessly pursue capital. And so it's a kind of convergence of forces, of selfishness, of greed, and of hatred in a moment where everyone feels as if, the ground beneath their feet has turned to sand, everyone except for the top 0.1%. And so, when I say that, sometimes I'll say, Andy, that we have to be better people. And it sounds so Pollyannish. We have to be better people. Because if we were better people, we wouldn't be satisfied with the world as it is. And it seems to me that there are folks who are appealing to grievance, appealing to our fears for their own gain. And some people find it easier to scapegoat others than to deal with the pain right in front of them. Right? Because at the heart of the problem is that we tend to imagine the American dream as a zero-sum game. Right? We can't bake a bigger pie because if, they tell us that we only have so much pie to go around, and that's a lie because we know some people are stealing most of it. And so I think we're at that moment, an inflection point, particularly with this generation that's coming up, a generation that has been raised, how can I put it? Cascading crises, cascading catastrophes. They know this shit is broken. And so they're open to, many of them at least, are open to imagining the country anew, while others in their generation are reaching for old vocabularies. They want to become the new brown shirts, as it were. And so, yeah, it's a scary moment, but it's a moment that's consistent with a country that refuses to grow up.
The Supreme Court, which
Yep.
is the branch of government charged with protecting our rights, our freedoms, in the recent past has not instilled the kind of confidence that they're doing a good job of that. In fact, they seem to be going in the opposite direction and almost saying the equivalent of, hey, it's great. Racism is over. It's finally over. You,
Right.
I think, retweeted something this week about a ruling with regard to the treatment of death row inmates.
Yeah, I think, again, this goes back to how mean-spirited people are. I think this is in the case of Alabama, I think.
Right.
And the rush to take a life in this way by people who claim to be pro-life, right? And part of the story of the court, Andy, is a story that it hasn't always. We tend to think of the Warren Court as kind of the example, right? But when we look at the history of the court, particularly when it comes to race matters, it hasn't been, shall we say, a clear and clean record.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think whether it's around the death penalty, whether it's around voting rights, whether it's around LGBTQ plus rights, whether it's around women's right to control their own bodies, we find the court actively moving on behalf of a constituency that aims to take us back. And what they're trying to take us back to isn't something that actually existed, right? They're trying to take us back to their idealization of what it means for cisgendered men, white men, to run the world. And it's a horrifying picture. And that court decision was cruel to my mind. It's just one example.
That decision involved 3 inmates who were executed. 2 of those executions of Alan Miller and Kenneth Smith were ultimately called off when prison officials could not access a suitable vein. Another inmate, Joe James, was put to death only after a 3-hour delay. It is beyond cruel.
Just cruel. It's just cruel. And, it's unconstitutional because it's cruel.
But the conservative justices don't seem to care. They don't seem to care.
Because these people, to their mind, are disposable.
Right.
This is why if we don't, Madison, as complicated as he is, understood that in order for democracies to work, it required a particular kind of human being. That's why virtue, character is so critical.
Right.
If we can't be those kinds of people, then this can't survive. It won't. That's why we have to be better people.
But it's
right.
interesting.
And I'm not talking about being more mannerable or decent or civil. I'm talking about virtue. I'm talking about character.
The scary part is that genie to me seems to have been let out of the bottle in terms of those virtues. And I don't know if you can put that back in once it's out. That's what scares me the most going forward.
Yeah. I try to resist a kind of fatalism. I come out of a tradition, Doc, where there was nothing reasonable about expecting that the world would change. Nothing. There was nothing about one's experience as an enslaved human being to lead you to believe that your life could be anything else but that.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the most extraordinary moments in American history is the moment in which slavery ends. And one of the first things the enslaved do is that they literally start walking, trying to find people they love. this person was sold down south and they start walking towards Mississippi. So in the midst of the darkness of the hour, I have this unabiding faith in the capacity of human beings who are at once sons of bitches to be miracles. We have done and we're capable of being miraculous as much as we are capable of being monstrous and wild beasts. I have to have that faith. If I don't, I'll drink too much Irish whiskey.
Yeah, no, I hang on to that same kind of optimism myself. I try to look at the things that have happened that are positive. The system did hold in the last couple of years. The courts, for the most part, reject all of Trump's nonsense. It's ugly, but the dam hasn't broken, but there's still a lot of
Right.
collateral damage. And racism
But
is one key element of that.
but Andy, I want to insist that it's not optimism. This is not Voltaire's Candide. This is not the best of all possible worlds, right? Think about that moment in Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. There's this moment when Denver, the young character who's been so obsessed with how she was born and the like, and history literally comes back as a ghost and is consuming her mother, and she has to step off the edge of the world, as Toni writes, right, in order to go save her mother. And she hesitates, she stops, fear grabs her, and then she has a memory. And she remembers her conversation between her grandmother and her mother, and her grandmother is giving Seth the business, right? Well, don't tell me about who these people are. They have more people these white folk have killed than the world has ever seen. This ain't a battle, it's a rout. That's what she remembers. And then she freezes, and then she hears the voice of her grandmother. Why aren't you walking down these steps? Don't you remember why I told you why I walked the way I walked? Don't you remember why your daddy did what he did? And then Denver says to her grandmother, but you said it was a rout. And she said, it is. Then what do I do? Know it, but going out the yard. That's not optimism.
Right.
You see, that's not optimism. That's not denying the darkness of the hour. That's not denying, that the wild beasts are rampaging. No. Know it, but going out the yard. Act anyway.
Persevere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What you did in response to that eighth grade educated man who tried to deposit something in your gut and you refused to. You knew it, but you went on out the yard anyway.
So when looking at the Supreme Court, 10 years ago, they gutted the Civil Rights Act. And the justification was we don't need it anymore, which is tantamount to saying, let's close the umbrella in a rainstorm because we've been dry, right? So it was idiotic.
Right.
And then affirmative action in Alabama defying an order to create a second black district in its redrawing of its congressional map. States defying the Supreme Court. Well, that's new territory for us as a country. That scares me when you see that. When you see Texas defying the Department of Justice to get rid of the floating barriers that are deemed inhumane to migrants. All of this just seems so back to a time when things were out of control. And that's really scary.
Right. Remember the words that dripped from the mouth of George Wallace, right? Interposition and nullification, right? We see these folk enacting it right now. What else is Alabama doing, right? What else? And so part of this insistence on telling our story in a very thick way so that we can understand the lineage of the moves that are being made and what it means not to resolve them, not to resolve the question once and for all, right? That you're not getting the virus out of the wound. You're not getting the infection out of the wound. And so what? The wound eventually gets worse, right? It seems like it's healed with the scab over it, but no, something else is going on here. And so ever since the last piece of major legislation of the Great Society, what is that? Fair Housing Act of 68? 12 years later, just 12 years later, Reagan is elected to undo it all. We are living in the culmination of 40 to 50 years, right, of political doings, right? We're living its exaggerated consequence now. And it's easy for us because we think in melodramatic terms in this country to see the evil character of Trump and these folk as the bearers of all wrongdoing. No. This is the culmination of choices we made when you and I were much younger.
Well, I want to end on something which, to go back to because I'm not sure if this is optimism or pessimism, but on Tuesday you tweeted, quote, "We have to become better people. Selfishness, greed, and hatred are destroying our world." And I'm trying to read between the lines. Are you meaning that we are really destroying our world, or we could be, but we're not because we're kind of moving forward in the right direction?
No, when we look at the world on fire, the planet is literally screaming. When we see what's going on across Europe in terms of the dark forces of hatred that are that's rearing its head, what we see in this country, we see unbridled greed driving all sorts of decision making. Selfishness so insidious that folk won't even put on a damn mask. Folk wouldn't even put on a mask. So they have no regard for their fellows, right? In the name of liberty, in the name of freedom, God forbid. So when I say that selfishness and greed and hatred are destroying our world, I mean that literally. And unless we decide to deal with the mess that's in us that lead us to make these sorts of choices, or to be silent in the face of these sorts of acts, then we are co-signers to the destruction of the world. So we all have to be better people. And again, I'm not talking about manners. I'm not talking about decency. I'm not talking about civility. I'm talking about a kind of moral disposition that says no, like Bartleby the Scrivener in Melville says, no, I prefer not, and willing to go down for that choice.
Well, this has been a truly important and compelling conversation, and I hope you'll come back again sooner than later to continue it.
I appreciate you, Andy. Thank you so much for being so patient with me, man.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy, and it was co-produced and co-edited by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. We'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate and review, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards. Have a great week.